not this type of not this type of person. Okay, many of them did not speak English and did not want to speak English. Many of them were desperately poor, had to flee with no possessions whatsoever, and they came in increasing numbers. So in 1914, the Jewish population in Britain had grown to 300,000. Okay? So these are not huge numbers, but they become symbolically very important. And there were increasing concerns about a so-called alien invasion, okay, that created a housing shortage in the east of London, and therefore rising rents. There was concern that Jews lived in overcrowded conditions because they didn't understand the British ideas of sanitation and civility, and that they undercut British workers. They didn't just take British jobs, they were prepared to work for lower wages, and they were prepared to have their wives and children work for them, particularly in the sort of sweated production of textiles. So therefore, Jews were not only dirty and uncivilized, they were unmanly because they were unable to support their families. This creates, as you see from this poster of a meeting in the East End of London, the formation of increasingly racist groups like the British Brothers League, who argue increasingly for acts of immigration to prevent more Jews from coming, the so-called destitute foreigners. Okay? In 1905, the outgoing Conservative administration introduces an Immigration Act for the very first time in British history, the so-called Aliens Act of 1905. And it's very self-consciously aimed at trying to get the support of the urban working class of London. But it's the beginning of a history of immigration which again becomes profoundly important to the history of Britain in the 20th century. Any questions in that? I know I'm going very fast. There's a lot to get through today. Jennifer. That's a great question. No is the basic answer. I mean, that happens in the 1940s through things like the introduction of by the state of a child allowance. But I'm not aware of any campaigns to try and encourage middle-class women to have more children. Which means I'll probably get an email from someone tomorrow or whenever this goes up on iTunes or YouTube saying, "You're wrong again, Vernon." Okay, so this final section of the lecture, which will be no less frantic because I have to cover the ground of only very small issues like the rise of the labour movement, quick return back to the issue of women's suffrage, and then, as all good British historians always do, you leave Ireland to the very last when you probably run out of time and can rush past it very quickly. So I'm going to talk about in those three headings, okay? And again, the point that I'm trying to get at here in each of these cases is to show the unraveling of liberalism as a mentality of government and the political exposure of its contradictions by these movements. And a central part of this section is also going to be returning to this idea that it's not just the empire that has to be governed by force and violence. It's also Britons at home. Okay, that's a vital connection. That colonial nationalists and Britons at home are beginning to see that they're governed in some ways with the same techniques or under the same conditions. I love that. That is the bell tolling for the Labour movement. In Britain we spell Labour with a U. It's another one of those words that you got lazy at and just thought, oh, we'll remove one of the key vowels. But we like to spell it with a U. First part of this story is the development of a new type of unionism from the 1880s onwards, from the 1870s, really. What do I mean by a new type of unionism? Okay, well, essentially, the early trade unions had been organized from the 1830s, after the repeal of the Combinations Act, around specific skills. Okay, so the weavers would have a union, the spinners would have a union. Okay, so that therefore in any one textile mill, because I'm taking textiles as my example, you might have different unions representing different workers. What the new unions did was organize workers by sector, not by skill. Okay? So that you would have a textile union that represented both weavers and spinners. That obviously gave unions much more power, because it meant that one set of workers weren't competing against another set of workers. And it meant that the union had the ability to shut down an entire mill or factory. And with this greater power came a growing determination to flex their muscles and to develop a more confrontational series of tactics to provoke strikes, basically. Trade union membership rises really, doubles between 1900 and 1914. And interestingly, as you'll see on Thursday, it's the First World War that does most to organize the labour movement through trade unions in Britain. But it has a very important head start through new unions in the second half of in the last few decades of the 19th and first year of the 20th century. The growing visibility and political clout of unions meant that you had an increasing number of political parties, as we saw last week, competing to represent the interests of labour. Okay? So a whole range of political parties, as I said on Thursday, I think, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and a whole series of different labour groups, tried to say, look, we represent the interests of labour. Union members can be members of our political party. Indeed, many unions had formal affiliations with the Liberal Party. Nonetheless, this bunch of different labour organisations that I talked about last week, the Social Democratic Federation, the Independent Labour Party, and the Fabian movement, coalesced into this thing known as the Labour Representation Committee in 1900. And it's the Labour Representation Committee that forms the basis of the party known as the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Representation Committee has a formal pact with the Liberal Party from 1903. Okay? So it doesn't see itself as a socialist party opposed to the Liberal Party. Very few members of the labour movement at this stage were opposed, for instance, to free trade. At the 1906 election, members of the Labour Party get 53 MPs. It's the first election where the Labour Party has a significant bloc in Parliament. Okay? that falls a little by 1910. They fall down to 40 MPs in 1910. Now, the important point that I want to make is that this is a party still effectively in conversation with the Liberal Party. Okay? And it's only in very specific areas where the Liberal Party is weak that the Labour Party emerges as having its own quite strong identity. Okay? And those areas are industrial Clydeside in Scotland, the West Riding in Yorkshire, the area around Bradford and Leeds, and the east of London. So in many ways, the Labour Party before 1914, I'm suggesting to you, and I'm doing this following the work of a great historian called Duncan Tanner, who died just far too young last year. And he showed, I think, very convincingly that the Labour Party remained a local party up until 1914. Okay? And it basically remains dominated by the Liberals. Now, there's another strand of this, which is that the Labour Party and Labour groups and the trade union movement consistently fail to represent the interests of unemployed men. Okay? Unemployed men, men who had no jobs, therefore could not be organised in unions, were consistently left out of the political appeals of the Labour Party and the trade union movement. And in 1905, you have the first hunger march launched from Leicester to march down to London to demonstrate against the conditions of unemployment. Many of these boot workers, boot workers were marching not to demonstrate the sturdiness of the boots that they once made, but the condition of their unemployment. Many of them were veterans of the South African War. And they argued, look, if we're good enough to fight and die for our country in South Africa, surely we should return home to jobs. And why is no one representing our interests in Parliament? Final part of this I want to allude to is that 1909 to 1912 sees the escalation of industrial unrest in Britain. A whole series of big strikes. A big rail strike in 1907, shipbuilders and coal miners go on strike in 1901, the dock workers and transport workers in 1911 and 1912, miners again in 1912, 1913 and 1914. And these strikes become increasingly confrontational. So in 1911, in the dock strike, 4 strikers are actually shot dead by police trying to contain the demonstrations. So there's a real sense of a gathering of the labour movement. It's still quite disconnected, uncoordinated, but there's real sense of the growing power of a new sector of the population. The Liberal Party responds to this by adopting a new name, by styling itself as the New Liberal Party with a new liberal creed. And at the heart of that was Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and launched this so-called People's Budget in 1909. And what the People's Budget did was introduce, really, the idea of the redistribution of wealth. Hardly something that the Liberal Party had ever contemplated before. So to do this, what Lloyd George did was expand income tax, critically introduce capital gains and death duties up to 25%, which was a big blow on the big people with landed estates, and this belies the real liberalism at the heart of this, duties on alcohol and tobacco. He was raising these funds, raising these forms of taxation in order to introduce new social measures. Okay? The first of which was the introduction of an old age pension. Remember, seniors